All right, boys and girls, so we've already made our clay. Now we're gonna talk about the next step, which is glazing your clay. So far when you made your clay pot, now I left it out in the air to dry. The air dries it out and turns it into this. It's called greenware. Then I cooked it in the kiln. After we cook our art in the kiln, which is that hot oven, now it's called bisqueware and it's hard, like a real clay pot or mug. So now that it has been fired, it's gonna be very fragile. What happens if I drop this? It's gonna break, correct. So I'm gonna give you a lot of tips today to help you be successful for dropping. And we're also gonna talk about glazing. Now when you glaze, there's a couple of very important rules. Miss Tebow's gonna go over the 4 rules of glazing. Our first rule is, do not mix colors. If you look down here at the table, you'll have trays that look like this. It's very clear I have my blue tray and my yellow tray. When I want to use my blue glaze, I dip in the blue. If I want yellow, I do not switch the brushes. I set my brush down and I switch to my yellow brush. So I'll demonstrate right here on one of my clay pots. As you're glazing, again, you pick up a brush from the tray. You're gonna notice it feels like regular paint, but this is glaze. And remember, glaze is paint for clay. So it's gonna actually turn into glass later when it gets fired in the kiln. If I want to switch to a different color, I set that brush down and I switch to my other brush. Very important, this glaze is still wet. If they touch, they will mix. I don't want that to happen, so I'm gonna keep them apart, and if they do touch, I'm gonna be so careful on the edges. What I don't want is to mix getting blue in this brush and adding it to the bowl. Rule number 1 is do not mix colors. Rule number 2 is that we need to add 2 to 3 layers. I'm gonna show you some examples of clay pots. This is a very successful glazing. You can see that this student put 2 to 3 layers and the color's shiny and bright, and I don't see blank white areas. In this example, very big difference. This student did not get every spot, and all those white areas do not get shiny and will not have color on them. So when we talk about making sure to add 2 to 3 layers, this is what that means. Right now, I painted this blue 1 time. That's 1 layer. Now, I'm going to take the same blue and I'm going to paint right on top for a 2nd layer. We would say this has 2 layers. Then I would paint right on top, and now we would say it has, everybody, 3 layers, correct. That's what we mean by our layers. All right, on to our next rule. Rule number 3 is cover everything. So you can see on this example that we talked about, if I didn't glaze everything, it's not going to be shiny in those areas and it's going to stay white. White is fine, but I have white glaze that will actually make it shiny. So you want everything to get covered. I have 2 examples. These are adding glaze to them right now. Look at my 2 examples and point to which one has glaze on everything. Correct, you should be pointing at this one. That means when this goes in the kiln, it's gonna turn out looking more like this with everything colored. When I put this in the kiln, it's gonna turn out looking more like this with lots of spots missing. So glaze everything. This is 3-dimensional. It's got a bottom, it's got sides. We want everything to get glazed, which leads me to the last rule of glazing. Glaze everything, but don't glaze the bottom. So the reason we don't glaze the bottom is this glaze is actually gonna turn into glass. It's gonna melt and it's gonna kind of turn into syrup in the kiln. As it dries, it turns into almost a glue and your clay pot will stick to the shelf. And honestly, guys, we have to bash it off the shelf to get it off. So to help you out, what Miss Tebow does is I actually wash the bottoms before we do it. So let me show you what I mean. On this finished example, I was very careful glazing, but it's gonna happen. You're gonna get little bits and pieces. That's okay. Later, I take a sponge with water and I scrub it off. So don't worry about little bits, but I should not see you purposely glazing the bottom of your pot. Right now, we're going to review our glazing plan, all of the rules we need to have. Our glaze rules are, number 1, do not mix colors. Number 2, add 2 to 3 layers. Number 3, cover everything. But number 4, don't glaze the bottom. Boys and girls, have fun glazing today.